Here's a listening tip that I certainly live by. You can decide whether this is something that you want to employ. When I go and listen to another system, whether it's at an audio show or at a friend's house or at a showroom somewhere, I never pay attention to the bass. Why? Why don't I pay attention to the bass? The answer is actually pretty complex, and it has to do with the modal region of acoustics. I've talked about this in some other videos and interviews that have been done with me. While the topic is certainly merits much longer than a soundbite video with a maximum of about 5 minutes, I'll try to condense it to this. In the modal region of acoustics, which is, well, depending on the distance you're sitting from the speakers and the size of the rooms, let's just say the first 2.5 octaves to 3 octaves of music. So that's about up to 160 hertz, 20 to 160 hertz maximum. For us to hear and appreciate sound pressure levels and their phase relationships to those impulses to the rest of the music, we require the boundaries of the room to hear it at all. If I took a subwoofer and raised it up from the ground by a crane, let's say 100 feet off of the ground, and then I lifted you on a second crane, also 100 feet off the ground, but about 10 feet away from the subwoofer, and then I played the first couple octaves of broadband noise from that subwoofer, you would hear almost nothing. You would hear a little bit more once the sound has traveled down to the ground and bounced back to you. The reason for this is because the acoustic coupling is so poor and the wavelengths at those lower frequencies are so long, they're certainly longer than the distance from you to the subwoofer. In normal listening rooms, this situation exists. We sit about 10 feet away from the speakers, subwoofers, but yet we can hear plenty of bass. Being able to hear it is a function of the room reflecting it back to us, those long wavelengths. Because we require the boundaries of the room in order to appreciate the bass, the speaker designer, with their best intentions and their quasi-anechoic responses, have really nothing to say. The room will have far more influence on how we hear that bass and how we appreciate that bass than anything they could do that would be modeled in a quasi-anechoic response. You could take the same exact speaker in 2 different rooms that are identically dimensioned but differently constructed. Place those speakers in the same position and place your listening position in the same position, and they sound completely different. I had a client in Mississippi who I installed a distributed bass array for, and he was very happy with those 4 subwoofers, each set up at different crossover points, different phase relationship. It was sounding great, but I left him with a prescription. His floor was very spongy, and I said, well, just put some floor jacks under the joists to stiffen up the floor. That will help on a number of dimensions. Once he put in those floor jacks, he got back to me and said, JR, the bass character completely changed. He actually had to turn off the bass array and only listen to the main speakers because with the addition of the bass array, now with the newly stiffened floor, the bass character in the room had completely changed. Well, think about that. Nothing else changed but the rigidity of one of the 6 surfaces in that room. Nothing else changed. But the bass character changed so much that he couldn't tolerate listening to it in the manner he was listening to it previously. I had to go back and reattune that system. I hadn't realized at the time that the advice I would be giving him would require a trip back for me, and I felt bad for that, but he was happy enough to have me back, and we got things sounding better than even before. The floor was more rigid. So the point is, you could go and evaluate the performance of a system in any given room, and you could really enjoy the bass or not really enjoy the bass. And I say, don't even think about it. Focus on what's called the statistical region of acoustics. That is the top 7 octaves, so about 150 hertz on up. What's going on there in the room? How is the system performing there? It is very, very difficult to get bass dialed in optimally. And few people have actually ever heard it. It's not getting bass dialed in optimally isn't just a function of getting flat frequency response. It's also, and I think this is even more important, getting fast decay time. I'll go into more detail on this in future videos. But for now, I do encourage you not to judge a speaker or a system based upon the bass performance that you perceive. It's just not up to the speaker designer how the bass is perceived once the initial impulse has left that subwoofer, that bass driver. That is completely up to the physics of the room, which unfortunately are very complex. That's it for this week's soundbite. See you next week.